Okay, so the first question is what do we mean when we talk about peace? And so our previous understanding of the term peace in like a completely textbook definition would be the lack of all violence in the society. But as we've discussed more, like we've seen how this is really difficult to achieve, and so we've decided that peace can be dynamic and there can be instances of violence, but just that the fact that we're moving towards a peaceful society and we're actually making like active efforts to be and become peaceful is good. And conflict doesn't count as violence, and conflict will occur in any society that is moving forward. And justice also can be incorporated into the definition of peace because justice can be used in response to violence. And so when we're talking about justice, the people that have had the violence committed against them should be the ones that decide what that justice looks like. And that's not really always going to be the case because just like the world it's not fair. But oppressors cannot define what equality and equity looks like because it's just inherently unfair. There's no way that they can accurately understand what the people that they have committed violence against, what they're going through, and what they need to be equal.
Okay, so next we talked about how our definitions inform our ways of observing and measuring the world around us. So first of all, we talked about the way that we define violence shapes our worldview. Specifically, we started talking about our view of like revolutions and protests. I think we saw a lot that assigning like morality to a violent or non-violent protest can be very dangerous because for a long time, especially in the American education system, we've been taught that nonviolent protest is the best way to go, and we've been pointed towards to look at the civil rights movement or Gandhi's actions, and a lot of times, like over the summer, people would look at the Black Lives Matter protests and say that they had gone too far, even though a lot of the violence was created by the police. We also looked at Galton's definition of violence, and since his definition of violence is so broad, we think that it could be possible that violence can be like very broadly defined, because what's possible for someone to reach their full potential, like everyone's full potential changes like depending on where you are in the world and like new technologies that are developing. And also we talked about the difference between conflict and violence, and how we think it was important that, or maybe that it's like conflict is more of a fact of life than violence is, which some of the earlier readings discussed that violence might be like inherently human, but we think that it might be conflict, and conflict is often solved with violence, but it doesn't have to be.
So another implication of this that both Maddie and Emily talked about, how our definition of peace is something that is dynamic and it's a dynamic process. So we were sort of grappling with how do we engage in that peaceful process, and if it's true that structural violence and personal violence are so interconnected, how do we address both those at the same time, or do we separate those and address it one by one? And so we sort of came to the conclusion that by addressing either structural violence or personal violence, that has the result of addressing the other form of violence as well. So we came up with two main examples for this, that if you address a system of structural violence like the carceral state, and then so you replace it with something that is much more peaceful and isn't that structural violence, then you're taking away a lot of the factors that cause people to become personally violent. So that will have the effect of reducing personal violence. And then conversely, if you address personal violence, like if you abolish war, then if people aren't having to survive day to day, they have the opportunity to engage in getting rid of structural violence. So that's a cause and effect of reducing personal violence will then lead to hopefully reducing structural violence. And then we said that if you're considering sort of which one to prioritize, and you say, well, let's address structural violence because then personal violence will go away, that those are two very different time frames. So we said it's also really important to address the personal violence that is currently a product of the structural violence. So we talked about domestic violence shelters. It's not that we should just be focusing on the structural causes of domestic violence. We should also be providing support in real time for the people who are experiencing that on a personal level. So it's sort of at the same time, you address big things and small things, and then they lead to better consequences.
And then the last question, how is gender related to our understandings of peace? We sort of bridged the second question about definitions and this last question with like the topic of intersectionality, because our definitions of and experiences with violence are like shaped based on race and orientation and class. So violence looks different based on your personal experience. Then we talked a bit about this sort of preconceived notion that women are naturally peaceful and men are naturally violent. And this like sometimes feminist trope that a few of us grew up with, that things would just like magically be better if women were in charge. But that doesn't really like address the underlying structural issues that would cause us to think that, because gender is a social construct and there's like really nothing inherent to femininity or women that would make them peaceful, because it's really based on like how we're socialized and how we're raised. So we were talking about like if people can be raised in a peaceful way, then perhaps we can be more mindful about this language. And then we talked a little bit about the weaponization of white femininity and how white women can be more likely to be confrontational to like service workers and people of color, etc. So that was sort of another intersection of gender and race in this case, to sort of like weaponize the violence, that white women can weaponize the violence committed against them towards someone else. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about the language of gender and terms like dominance and superiority. So people are socialized into this language and may become more aggressive because they've been taught that this is the norm and because they use language like that. And then that can definitely influence how we perceive gender in this case.